So the last speaker before dinner, although not the last speaker of the conference, we will have one after we are all well fed and full of beverages, is John Kessler, Associate Professor in Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Rochester. Chemical oceanographer who focuses on how oceanic dynamics influence atmospheric greenhouse gas budgets. He earned his PhD from the University of California, Irvine, conducted his postdoctoral research at Princeton, and is the recipient of a Sloan Research Fellowship in the Ocean Sciences.
Thank you very much. Having a microphone here is actually really good. I'm a bit of a walker, so this kind of tethers me at least into one spot. As you can see from the title, today I'm going to be talking about some of the ways that big data plays a role in ocean sciences. I'm going to begin by just highlighting, I would say, 3 or 4 or 5 of the major efforts for using big data in the ocean sciences. But if I was to ponder what is the biggest role, the highest impact that big data science can play in the ocean sciences, and all of geosciences for that matter, I would say that it's more in terms of data integration. Whether that data is from a, quote, classical big data source, or even some of the smaller data sources. We'll get into that. Well, this talk almost actually didn't occur today, and I tried to keep that from the organizers of this session. Relatively recently, I was called for jury duty, and watching the trending of the numbers they were calling to report in the evenings, it seemed like Friday I would hit. But fortunately, as I phoned in last night, as you can see, I got let go. So where I'd like to begin is just giving a few examples of how big data plays a role in some of the ocean sciences. One of the main roles, I would say, is satellite imagery. Here we have a few different maps of ocean surface color, which is ultimately used to map out chlorophyll concentrations, and which is used then as a proxy for rates of primary production. The classic way of measuring rates of primary production is to go out, collect discrete samples, and measure those rates with some biochemical techniques. This obviously gives you a much more comprehensive view of oceanic processes, as well as our ability to get very good time resolution maps on that as well. Ocean color is just but one of the many measurements that can be done via satellite. Ocean surface temperature is another one. There's global maps of this. This is one that I just pulled out for the Gulf of Mexico. We can see how the ocean surface temperature changes throughout the course of a year in this simulation. We're getting close to winter time at this point. And ultimately, you can see then how the temperature cools down in the northern Gulf. Another avenue how big data plays a role in ocean sciences is through in situ instrumentation. Again, the more fundamental way at which we can determine ocean physical, biological, chemical, and geological processes is to go out and collect discrete samples. If we're looking at ocean water from the surface down to the sediment surface, we're lucky if we can get a profile of a dozen points. Now the push is in the realm of developing in situ instrumentation that can be lowered from the sea surface to the seafloor and make measurements at a rate of tens to hundreds of samples per second so that we can measure these properties dynamically and how they change from, say, sea surface to seafloor. The vertical axis here represents the sea surface going all the way down to the seafloor. The horizontal axis represents, there's actually 4 different scales here for the 4 different example parameters which I'm representing here for this one example. You can see these scientists deploying this one sensor here. We've got temperature, we've got salinity, we've got dissolved oxygen, and this right here is a measurement of some fluorescence properties telling us more about dissolved organic matter. A third way we can think about big data in the ocean sciences, I would say, is through some of the larger global sampling campaigns. And this was one that was conducted in the mid-90s, the World Ocean Circulation Experiment. I would say there's been or four of these big global programs that have been established and carried out. One of the cruise tracks that was conducted here started out in the North Atlantic to the South Atlantic around Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, and finally coming back up into the Northern Pacific. And again, at all of these stations, they're measuring concentrations and distributions in the surface ocean dynamically as these vessels are transiting the ocean. They're also measuring the profiles that we saw in the previous diagram. Here collecting data, again, tens to hundreds of samples per second at each of these profiles. And ultimately, in addition, doing some more sophisticated analyses that can only be done on discrete samples. The product, the final product of these type of global campaigns can easily be classified in the big data realm as we start to then make sense of what the global processes are controlling all of this. These distributions here are actually taking this U-shaped coarse transect profile and now flattening it out. The right-hand side of the axis corresponds to the North Atlantic. We transit down to the equatorial Atlantic, South Atlantic, around Antarctica, and up the Pacific. And just some of the various profiles that were measured during these campaigns, from temperature, salinity, some nutrients like nitrate, phosphate, silicic acid, the natural radiocarbon content of inorganic waters telling us how long it's been removed from active exchange with the atmosphere, oxygen and oxygen utilization rates, which ultimately plays out with respiration processes. I would say in more modern circles, the infiltration of modern microbial molecular biological techniques has come into play. Here we've got some DNA surveys looking at some 16S RNA to actually tell us who the organisms are in a specific environment. If we're looking at chemical changes, ultimately, it'd be interesting to know who's making those changes, and have they been related to some organisms that have been cultured, that we have a much more fundamental understanding of their biochemical processes. Easily a big data enterprise. And finally, I would easily say that global modeling of many oceanographic processes, from heat and momentum transport to elemental and molecular cycles, ultimately are classified as big data as well. Here we have some distributions of iron across the oceans, and the sources, the different processes controlling the sources and sinks of this one trace element that's ultimately viewed as a nutrient for photosynthetic activity. There's no way that we can make this many iron measurements across the ocean, so what we do is we try to get an understanding of the fundamental processes that control them, make some of the actual measurements, and then make a global distribution based on that fundamental understanding. But I would, again, like I began with saying, while each of these individual techniques can be looked at as analyzing, mining, modeling, even collecting large sets of big data, they're really only one piece of the puzzle. And we can certainly say on each of these, yes, we've got a very nice understanding of that one puzzle piece, but it does not give us the broader perspective of many issues that are often raised by society. We need the integration of many different pieces of data, from big data to small data, in order to answer those questions. So I would say that while each of these are incredibly important in the big data field, more the data integration science is what enables us to answer some of these large questions. Now, in all the classes that we have to teach, the buzzword these days is more or less learning by example, topic-based education. As students asked us, well, why do I need to know this? We always want to be there from the start with an example of the application of this. So where I'd like to take this for the remaining half of my talk is follow one specific issue and how separate components of both big and small data can be integrated together to answer some larger societally relevant questions. The one that's plaguing most of our scientific minds these days is global climate change. I would love to follow that one here, but in approximately 10 minutes, that's probably one that I can't do justice. So instead, I try to think of what's one area that is much like the global climate change example, where there are both natural processes as well as some man-made perturbations that are influencing a system. And in that sense, the kind of mini example that came out was the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, one that I was fortunate enough to participate in as a scientist, making some better understanding of this, where we can look at both a anthropogenic perturbation, how the system responds to that perturbation, and ultimately then recovers in a natural way. So I'd like to begin by one of the very first studies that came out on this disaster. Again, a big data enterprise that was conducted by the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, a group that conducts very high resolution models of ocean and atmospheric processes. And here they were looking at determining what was the fate distribution of the hydrocarbons emitted. The take-home message from this is they were looking at the hydrocarbons that were emitted going to two different places, more or less the ocean surface, as well as a significant portion staying dissolved and trapped in the deep ocean waters. After that, they then started modeling out the biodegradation of those hydrocarbons. And that's what I have shown right in here. This is looking at the Northern Gulf, again, using some of these high-resolution models, definitely a big data enterprise, to look at where it went and ultimately then what its fate would be. Now, just like you and I, as we consume, as we digest and respire a specific, let's say, apple, we're going to consume oxygen as part of this process. And as bacteria in the deep waters of this oil spill start to consume oil, they're going to consume oxygen as well. So what they're modeling here is actually the oxygen loss from the deep waters, assuming that there's a significant amount of oil in there. And what they have determined is that based on the material that was released, there should be large expansive areas. You can see this is the kind of the end of the Bird's Foot Delta in Louisiana. Large expansive areas that in the deep waters that actually go completely anoxic, where they have no oxygen. That biodegradation process actually suffocating those deep waters. This was more or less the first study that came out. From there, though, if we take that as the be-all and the end-all and not integrate that one puzzle piece with the rest, we get a distorted view of what actually occurred during this disaster. One other big data enterprise that we can start to use to get a sense of where that oil went, again, is satellite imagery. We can look at the reflection off of the ocean surface, and that gives us an estimate of oil sheen that's there. We can easily take an image and do some image processing to get the area of that oil sheen. We can go out to sea and do some sea truthing estimates to get the thickness of that oil sheen. And from that, we can actually determine the volume as well as the mass of the oil that's in those layers. So while that first model started to put stuff together in a computer simulation, the second big data enterprise that came along started to look at this now and quantify the distribution based on some satellite imagery. Besides what was ending up on the sea surface, some of the released hydrocarbons were also going up into the atmosphere and simply being volatilized from the ocean surface. This was one of the areas in which we got involved. And some of the instrumentation that we develop in our laboratory, it's laser-based spectroscopy instrumentation that enables us to measure the concentrations of various hydrocarbons with high accuracy, precision, and pretty darn fast. It's called cavity ring-down spectroscopy. In essence, what we're doing is we're watching the exponential decay of light as it transits a medium. If there's more hydrocarbons in there, it'll decay faster. If there's less, it'll decay slower. And from that change in decay rate, we can ultimately get out the concentration that is there. Now, the these decay rates are unbelievably fast. First of all, the one that is depicted here that we collected lasts approximately 100 microseconds. But in order to characterize that thoroughly, we're actually sampling data at a rate of about 2.5 megahertz. The pink is a theoretical fit to our data. The black is not a solid line behind it. It's actually discrete data points collected at those rates. Nonetheless, we look at this entire process, and with 100 microseconds, we can collect, roughly 1,000 or so of these every second, which then gives us a very accurate view of not just the concentration of various hydrocarbons in the surface waters and then into the atmosphere, but also some of its isotopic properties as well. One of the techniques that we did was we continually pumped seawater from the ocean surface on board. We were then allowing some of those hydrocarbons that were at the sea surface to come to equilibrium with the headspace. We would then inject it from there continually into our cavity ring down chamber to make those measurements dynamically. This is a plot in the northern Gulf of Mexico. The wellhead, ground zero, was right there. And all of these lines, again, are not lines. They're discrete data points. Wherever the boat would go, we would make measurements of these hydrocarbon concentrations in the surface waters in the atmosphere to ultimately determine how quickly it was then volatilizing and going up into the atmosphere. Contrast that more big data strategy to a small data strategy. And again, I'm not trying to knock anybody here. In fact, I would say 1, 2, 3 of the authors on this paper are probably my top 3 colleagues in the entire field. But this is the alternative way to big data of going out and just collecting discrete samples. Now, this is not in the Gulf of Mexico, and this is not at the same time period, but it is the same type of analysis. And they're looking here now at the air-sea exchange of the gas methane. They collect about 30, maybe 40 discrete samples in this region off of Santa Barbara, California. And from that, they're able to then extrapolate out what that exchange rate might be. Well, 30 to 40 samples for us occurred in about half a minute. And processes which they skip over in their rather coarse sampling, we're able to see in a very dynamic way since we're sampling with such high resolution. And we can see very small changes at very small areas at very specific times. Besides looking at what's going into the atmosphere, what's on the sea surface, there's also a significant component of what's actually below the sea surface and remaining dissolved in ocean water. So we need to begin to probe that as well. And again, I introduced some of the instrumentation that is able to measure those parameters dynamically as we go from the sea surface here all the way down to the sea floor. This is a measure of dissolved oxygen. And again, the rates are set by the instrument, but we're talking roughly 10 to 100 samples per second. That gives us a fine characterization of dissolved oxygen. This is looking at fluorescence properties. Fluorescence actually tells us how much dissolved oil is in the water. So this little peak right here is corresponding to a peak of deep water dissolved oil. This is potentially one in the surface, although there's a lot of biological activity in the surface as well that can help to confuse this signal. But again, the take-home message that I'm trying to emphasize is not that there's one big data technique that is the be-all and end-all. Instead, it is the integration of both big data and small data techniques that allows us then to make these sorts of large societally relevant conclusions. This is just one effort that was put together by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to coordinate every last person's data that was collected during this event. From platforms that were measuring hydrocarbons in the atmosphere as they would volatilize off, to sea-based platforms, to even some of these gliders, which are autonomous vehicles, basically robotic dolphins with sensors on them that can then swim through and make chemical measurements as well. But more or less, all of the analyses from the spill are here. You can go through, download them, and mine them in any way that your heart so desires. Let's see how fast the internet is. So there's a few of these here that we were fortunate enough to participate in. You can get the raw data off as you filter through these sorts of things. But here are just some of the plots from, let's say, one of the expeditions I was at. And again, right then and there. Oops. Yes, what I want. Great. So as we then start to integrate all of these different data together, be it from satellites, be it from in situ measurements, we start to get a general picture on where everything is going. Here we have, on the horizontal axis, an actual chemical analysis of each last molecule that was actually emitted from the wellhead. The mass fraction of each of those molecules. The black curve on the background is the distribution of what was actually emitted from the well. And each of these different components represents where those hydrocarbons went. The top one is looking at what was made it up to the surface and volatilized to the atmosphere. The one that's in the middle is looking at what's remaining as that crude on the surface. And the bottom one are the hydrocarbons that were actually dissolved in those deep plumes. Now, after we have integrated that data and we have a better idea on where it is, the next question is, where is it going to go and what's its fate? And there's a humongous big data network of all of the buoys that are out surrounding the planet in a very nice, easily searchable way. In fact, they have data up to the minute, more or less, from each of these locations. Now, if I look at this one, oops, come on, right here, if it'll click, there we go. Not only do they have active points of collection, but they have inactive ones as well. Not only the classic buoys that we are used to seeing, but also on every offshore rig, they're required to have the same instrumentation for safety reasons. If we see currents or meteorologic conditions changing in a dramatic way, we want to make sure that those workers out there are safe. This is the Deepwater Horizon rig, the one that blew up. And as you can see, station disestablished on April 22nd, 2010. Actually, that's a little bit a day after it blew up. And if we look at the data that is produced, that again is streamed to these sorts of sites dynamically, if we had an active one, it would be coming up as we speak. This one here being an archived, we have the, it's slightly cut off, but it goes the year, the month, the day. We've got month, day, hour, then we have current speeds and directions. Interestingly enough, if we scroll the whole way to the bottom, as it's giving us more and more and loading more and more data, it gets us to the exact minute when the rig exploded, giving us the data up until that very point, shutting off right then at that moment. So despite the horrific disaster, one of the things that it does for us is it tells us current speeds and current directions. For oil that's in the ocean waters, it tells us where it gives us a predictive capability on where it's going to go. So one of the analyses that we wanted to do, not only tracking the oil, but also looking at its biodegradation, was to look at the oxygen in the waters. And this was, again, us assembling data from these repositories of roughly 1,300 profiles of dissolved oxygen, again, each with these high-resolution profiles. And these little dips in dissolved oxygen we see at this depth and this depth actually correspond to the biodegradation of the hydrocarbons in those specific layers. When we sum up all of that oxygen lost, we start to be able to get a picture of how much oxygen was lost and how it varied in space and how it varied in time. Ultimately, if that oxygen loss is corresponding to hydrocarbons eaten, it tells us how much was eaten at a certain time period and ultimately total for this disaster. This is May 2010. In June, that area of oxygen loss grows. In July, it grows more. In August and September, it reaches its max as all of the hydrocarbons in the deep waters have more or less been biodegraded at that point in time. And finally, the question being, well, who's actually degrading it? Some of our colleagues were doing some DNA surveys on this. And early in the spill, in May, they noticed some organisms that were previously linked to oil degradation. But by the end of the spill, the natural gas components, methane, ethane, propane, butane, organisms linked to the decomposition of those now were starting to creep up into their biological surveys. So again, it's really the integration of techniques and methods, both big data and small data, that enables us to answer questions. If we're just focusing on one big data technique, we only really get a picture of one puzzle piece. It's the assembly of all of those different puzzle pieces that enables us to actually see, number one, where did everything go? How is it transported, distributed, and ultimately, what was its fate? So even with large amounts of data, one technique provides understanding for only one piece of the problem. But the integration of numerous techniques encompassing both large and small data fields is essential for our topics of global significance. It plays out not just in ocean sciences, but I would certainly don't think it's a stretch to say that plays out in all of geosciences as well. The big topic for us, I would say, is not just big data, but data integration science. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions here before we have our break? Okay, I mean, well, let's give John an extra round of applause for taking the last position. I said I actually couldn't agree more with this issue of data integration. It really is one of the key areas where data science and complex systems comes together with what in computer science what we call systems work and database work.